On June 14th, 1984, three friends left their small Colorado town for what should have been a simple weekend camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. Mark Davidson, 19, was the leader of the group, known for his careful planning and respect for the wilderness. His childhood friend, Jake Morrison, also 19, was the joker, always ready with a story or prank to lighten the mood. Sarah Chen, 18, was the newest member of their trio, but her sharp instincts and outdoor skills had quickly earned their trust. The three had been planning this trip for months. They'd studied maps, checked weather forecasts, and packed everything they thought they'd need for 3 days in the backcountry. Mark's older brother had lent them his four-season tent, a heavy canvas structure that could withstand mountain storms. Sarah brought her father's camping gear, including a reliable camp stove and emergency supplies. Jake, true to form, packed what he called the essentials: a deck of cards, a harmonica, and enough stories to last a week. They drove Mark's beat-up Ford pickup to the trailhead early Friday morning, the bed loaded with their gear and enough food for the planned 3-day excursion. The weather looked perfect: clear skies and mild temperatures. The forecast called for possible afternoon thunderstorms, but nothing severe. They'd camped in worse conditions before. The plan was straightforward. They'd hike 5 miles up the familiar Cascade Trail to a meadow they'd visited several times before. It was a spot Mark had discovered 2 summers earlier, a hidden clearing surrounded by towering pines with a small stream running through it, perfect for camping, with easy access to water and enough flat ground for their tent. Local park rangers knew the area well. It was considered moderately challenging, but safe for experienced hikers. The trail was well marked, and the meadow was far enough from the main hiking routes to offer solitude without being truly remote. Search and rescue teams had easy access if needed, though they rarely had calls from that particular area. The three friends had camping experience. Mark had been hiking these mountains since he was 12, often with his father, who taught him wilderness survival skills. Sarah had grown up spending summers at her grandmother's cabin in the Rockies, learning to read weather patterns and navigate by compass. Jake, despite his playful nature, was surprisingly competent in the outdoors and had completed wilderness first aid training the previous year. They signed in at the ranger station, listing their planned route and expected return date of Monday evening. The ranger on duty, a veteran named Tom Bradley, knew Mark from previous trips and wasn't concerned about the group's preparedness. He reminded them about the standard precautions, bare safety, and the importance of staying on marked trails, especially if weather moved in. The hike to their campsite was uneventful. They made good time, reaching the meadow by mid-afternoon on Friday. The spot was exactly as they remembered it, peaceful and secluded. They set up camp methodically, Mark directing the tent placement while Sarah organized their food supplies and Jake gathered firewood. That first evening passed quietly. They cooked a simple dinner over their camp stove, played cards by lantern light, and shared stories around a small campfire. The night was clear and cold, perfect for sleeping. They had done this dozens of times before, and everything felt routine and comfortable. Saturday morning brought the first signs of changing weather. The clear skies of the previous day gave way to building clouds, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Still, it wasn't unusual for mountain weather, and they'd prepared for the possibility of rain or even snow. They spent Saturday exploring the area around their campsite. Sarah wanted to photograph the wildflowers that were just beginning to bloom at that elevation. Jake practiced his harmonica, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks. Mark studied his topographic maps, planning possible day hikes for Sunday. By Saturday afternoon, the clouds had thickened considerably. The wind picked up, and they could see dark storm clouds building over the higher peaks to the west. It looked like they might be in for some serious weather, but they'd weathered mountain storms before. Their tent was sturdy, and they had enough food and fuel to wait out whatever nature threw at them. The storm hit Saturday night with a ferocity none of them had experienced before. What started as light rain quickly escalated into a full mountain blizzard. The wind howled through the trees, and snow began falling heavily. The temperature plummeted, and visibility dropped to almost zero. Inside their tent, the three friends huddled together, listening to the storm rage outside. The canvas walls of their shelter shook and snapped in the wind, but the tent held. They'd staked it down securely, and Mark had chosen their campsite well, in a spot protected by large trees. The storm continued through the night and into Sunday. By morning, they found themselves trapped under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. The wind was still howling, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. This wasn't the kind of weather you traveled in, especially not with limited visibility and treacherous trail conditions. They made the decision to stay put and wait for the storm to pass. It was the right choice from a safety perspective, but it meant they'd miss their planned Monday departure. They had enough food for an extra day or two, and they could melt snow for water if needed. Sunday passed slowly. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and they spent most of the day inside their tent, conserving body heat and trying to stay dry. Jake kept their spirits up with jokes and stories, while Sarah rationed their food supplies. Mark monitored their gear, checking for any damage from the storm. By Monday morning, the storm had finally begun to weaken, but the conditions were still treacherous. The snow was deep, and the trails would be impassable without proper equipment. They didn't have snowshoes or the heavy winter gear needed for travel in these conditions. They decided to give it one more day, hoping the weather would improve enough for them to make their way back to the trailhead. They had enough food for another day, maybe 2 if they were careful. The tent was holding up well, and they were managing to stay reasonably warm and dry. But Tuesday brought a fresh wave of storms. The wind returned with renewed fury, and more snow began to fall. They were now 3 days overdue, and they knew people would be looking for them. The question was whether searchers would be able to reach them in these conditions. The reality of their situation was beginning to set in. They were trapped in a high-altitude meadow during one of the worst early summer storms in recent memory. The snow was too deep to hike out safely, and the weather showed no signs of improving. They had limited food and fuel and no way to communicate with the outside world. Wednesday morning brought a brief break in the weather, but it was too little, too late. The snow was now waist-deep in places, and the temperature remained well below freezing. Even if they could navigate the buried trails, they didn't have the equipment or energy reserves for such a dangerous journey. That's when they made the decision that would define their ordeal. They would have to leave their campsite and try to find better shelter, somewhere that offered more protection from the elements and perhaps a way to signal for help. The meadow that had seemed so perfect just days before had become a trap. They broke camp in the early afternoon, packing only the essentials: the tent, sleeping bags, remaining food, and emergency supplies. Everything else would have to be left behind. They struggled through the deep snow, following what they hoped was the trail back toward the main hiking routes. The journey was exhausting. The snow was deep and unstable, and they had to break trail through drifts that sometimes reached their chests. The cold was bitter, and they stopped frequently to rest and warm their hands and feet. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. As evening approached, they realized they wouldn't make it back to the established trails before dark. They needed to find shelter and wait for morning. That's when they spotted what looked like a small structure through the trees, barely visible in the fading light. It was an old hunting cabin, weathered and partially collapsed, but it offered more protection than their tent in the open meadow. They forced open the door and found themselves in a single room with a stone fireplace and remnants of old furniture. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. They spent that night in the cabin, huddled around a small fire they managed to build in the fireplace. The smoke gave them hope that someone might see it and investigate. They took turns keeping the fire going, feeding it with broken furniture and debris from around the cabin. Thursday brought clearer skies, but even colder temperatures. The storm had passed, but winter had settled over the mountains with a vengeance. They could see the trail system in the distance, but it was still miles away through deep snow and dangerous terrain. They decided to stay at the cabin another day, hoping the weather would continue to improve and that search teams might spot their smoke. They had very little food left, maybe enough for one more day if they were careful. The situation was becoming desperate. Friday morning was clear and cold. They made the decision to make one final push toward the main trails, hoping to encounter search teams or at least reach a more accessible location. They left most of their gear at the cabin, taking only the absolute essentials. The journey through the snow-covered wilderness was the most difficult thing any of them had ever attempted. They were weak from days of limited food and constant cold. The snow was still deep, and the effort of breaking trail was exhausting. They had to stop frequently to rest and warm their extremities. By afternoon, they were making progress, but were still miles from the nearest maintained trail. The sun was getting lower, and they knew they'd have to find shelter again soon. That's when they spotted the helicopter in the distance, the first sign of the search efforts that had been ongoing for days. They tried to signal the aircraft, waving their arms and yelling, but it was too far away and moving too quickly. Still, it gave them hope. People were looking for them, and they were searching in the right area. They just had to survive long enough to be found. That night, they found shelter under a large boulder overhang, building a small fire and sharing their last remaining food. They were exhausted, cold, and hungry, but they were alive. They'd made it through the worst of the storm, and help was somewhere out there looking for them. Saturday brought more search activity. They could hear helicopters in the distance, and occasionally caught glimpses of aircraft through the trees. They kept their fire burning, hoping the smoke would be visible from the air. They also used their emergency whistle, blowing it in 3 blast patterns whenever they heard aircraft nearby. But the searchers didn't find them that day or the next. The wilderness was vast, and the snow had changed the landscape dramatically. Landmarks were buried, and the usual search patterns were disrupted by the impossible conditions. Days blended together in a cycle of survival and hope. They found occasional shelter, scrounged for anything edible, and maintained their fire whenever possible. The search continued, but the window for finding them alive was closing rapidly. Then, on the 14th day of their ordeal, something changed. The weather had finally stabilized, and the snow began to consolidate. Search teams could access areas that had been impassable during the storm. Aircraft could fly more systematic search patterns. But by then, the three friends had been missing for 2 weeks. The initial intensive search had been scaled back, and the official rescue operation was winding down. The consensus was that no one could have survived that long in those conditions without proper equipment and shelter. The families refused to give up. Mark's parents, Jake's family, and Sarah's relatives continued to pressure authorities to keep looking. They organized volunteer search parties and hired private investigators. The community rallied around the effort, but the mountains had swallowed their children without a trace. Summer arrived, and the snow finally melted from the high country. Searchers returned to areas that had been inaccessible during the storm. They found the traces of the friends' passage, the abandoned gear at their original campsite, signs of their movement toward the old cabin. But they never found the three friends themselves. The investigation continued for months, then years. Every lead was followed, every possible scenario explored. The case remained open, but active searching eventually ceased. The families never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering what had happened to their children in those final days. The mystery became part of local legend, a reminder of how quickly the mountains could claim the unprepared, how even experienced hikers could vanish without a trace. 14 years passed, the case files gathered dust, and the intensive searches became memories. The families had memorialized their children, but they never had closure. The mountains had kept their secret, and 3 young lives had become part of the wilderness forever. Then, in the summer of 1998, a group of backcountry researchers conducting a wildlife survey made an extraordinary discovery. Deep in a remote valley, miles from any established trail, they found the remains of a camp. A faded tent, barely recognizable after years of exposure to the elements, stretched between 2 pine trees. The tent was old, the fabric deteriorated and torn, but it was clearly man-made. Inside, protected from the worst of the weather, the researchers found sleeping bags, personal items, and a journal. The final entry was dated June 28, 1984, exactly 14 years earlier. The journal belonged to Mark Davidson, and it told the story of their final days, how they'd survived the initial storm, made their way to the old cabin, and eventually found this remote valley, how they'd managed to stay alive for weeks, living off the land and maintaining hope that rescue would come. The final entries painted a picture of 3 young people who'd fought against impossible odds, who'd used every skill they possessed to survive in the wilderness. They'd found a source of fresh water, managed to catch fish and forage for edible plants. They'd maintained their shelter and kept detailed records of their experiences. But the journal also revealed the cruel irony of their situation. They'd survived the storm, survived the initial weeks of their ordeal, only to find themselves trapped in a location so remote that no search team had ever reached it. They'd been alive for at least 6 weeks after their disappearance, possibly longer. The discovery of the tent and journal finally gave the families the closure they'd sought for 14 years. Their children had been resourceful, brave, and determined. They'd fought for their lives until the very end, and they'd faced their fate together, just as they'd lived their lives together. The tent and its contents were carefully preserved and studied. The journal became a testament to the human spirit, to the bonds of friendship, and to the power of hope in the face of impossible circumstances. It was a reminder that sometimes survival isn't about rescue. Sometimes it's about dignity, courage, and refusing to give up even when the odds are insurmountable. The 3 friends had found a way to tell their story, even 14 years later. Their tent, hidden in that remote valley, had protected their final words until someone could find them and carry their story back to the world. It was their last gift to the families who'd never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, and never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would be revealed. The discovery of Mark Davidson's journal was just the beginning. As investigators pored over his final entries, the true extent of their ordeal became clear. The 3 friends hadn't simply succumbed to the elements. In those first desperate days, they had survived for weeks in that remote valley, using every skill they'd learned from years of outdoor adventures. The journal revealed their methodical approach to survival. They had rationed their food carefully, melted snow for water, and created elaborate signals, hoping to catch the attention of search aircraft. Mark's handwriting grew shakier as the days passed, but his determination never wavered. He wrote about Jake's ability to start fires in impossible conditions, about Sarah's knowledge of edible plants, and about their shared commitment to never give up. What struck the investigators most was the evolution of their situation. The early entries described panic and fear, but as weeks turned into a month, something shifted. The 3 friends had adapted, creating a routine that kept them alive and mentally strong. They told stories, shared memories, and made plans for what they'd do when they were rescued. They never used the word if. The research team that found their camp discovered evidence of their ingenuity everywhere. Makeshift tools carved from wood and stone, a complex water collection system using their tarp and cooking equipment, fire pits positioned strategically to maximize heat while minimizing smoke visibility. These weren't the desperate actions of people giving up. These were the calculated moves of survivors who believed rescue would come. But the most haunting discovery was in Mark's final entries. His handwriting became increasingly difficult to read, not from despair, but from the physical toll their ordeal was taking. He wrote about Sarah's persistent cough that wouldn't go away, about Jake's infected cut that kept getting worse, despite their best efforts to treat it. He described their growing weakness, their difficulty staying warm, and their dwindling hope as summer turned to autumn and no rescue materialized. The last legible entry was dated nearly 6 weeks after their disappearance. Mark had written simply, "We tried our best. We never stopped believing someone would find us. Tell our families we love them, and we're sorry we couldn't make it home." The forensic team worked carefully to piece together their final days. The evidence suggested they had remained together until the very end, their bodies found within yards of each other in the makeshift shelter they'd constructed. They had died not from a single catastrophic event, but from the slow accumulation of exposure, malnutrition, and untreated injuries that even their remarkable survival skills couldn't overcome. The discovery sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community. These weren't inexperienced hikers who'd made fatal mistakes. These were skilled outdoorsmen who'd done everything right, who'd survived far longer than anyone thought possible in such harsh conditions. Their story became a testament to human resilience and the power of friendship in the face of impossible odds. The families found some measure of peace in knowing their loved ones hadn't suffered alone. Mark's journal painted a picture of three friends who supported each other through their darkest hours, who shared their fears and hopes, who never abandoned their belief in each other or in the possibility of rescue. The site where they'd made their final stand became a memorial of sorts. The research team carefully preserved their camp, documenting every detail before respectfully removing their remains. The tent, the journal, the improvised tools, all became part of a story that would be remembered not as a tragedy, but as an extraordinary example of human courage and determination. The investigation also led to changes in search and rescue protocols. The fact that three experienced outdoorsmen had survived for weeks in an area that had been searched multiple times raised serious questions about search methodologies. New technologies were developed, search patterns were refined, and training programs were updated to ensure that future searches would be more thorough and effective. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was the inspiration it provided to others. The journal entries were eventually published with the family's permission, becoming a powerful reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, the human spirit can endure. Their story was told in schools, in survival training courses, and in mountain rescue organizations around the world. The families established a foundation in their memory dedicated to improving wilderness safety and supporting search and rescue operations. They funded new equipment, sponsored training programs, and worked to ensure that other families wouldn't have to endure the uncertainty they'd lived with for 14 long years. Years later, when people spoke of the three friends of the Rockies, they didn't dwell on the tragedy of their deaths. Instead, they remembered their courage, their loyalty to each other, and their refusal to give up hope. They became symbols of the best of human nature, proof that even when faced with impossible odds, friendship and determination can light the way through the darkest of times. The mountain that had claimed their lives also became their monument, a reminder that while nature can be unforgiving, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things when tested by adversity. The forensic analysis wrapped up on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Detective Miller stood over the evidence table, sweat beading on his forehead as he studied the final batch of reports. The tent material had yielded more than anyone expected. Beneath layers of accumulated grime and mountain debris, they'd found something that changed everything. Embedded in the fabric were fibers that didn't belong to any of the three friends. The lab confirmed its synthetic material from a jacket, likely worn by someone who'd been in close contact with the tent after the storm. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The fibers were fresh, deposited within the last 2 years, not from 1984. Someone had been visiting the site regularly. Someone who knew exactly where Mark, Jake, and Sarah had made their final stand against the elements. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the families who'd been following every development. Sarah's mother, Margaret, sat in the detective's office, clutching a tissue as Miller explained what they'd discovered. Her daughter's journal had become a roadmap to the truth, but now that truth was taking on dimensions nobody had anticipated. The forensics team had also found something else. Hidden beneath a false bottom in Jake's backpack, they discovered a small waterproof pouch containing a roll of film. The images, though once developed, revealed the friends' final days in haunting detail. Pictures of their makeshift shelter, their dwindling supplies, and most significantly, shots of the surrounding area that seemed to document someone else's presence. In one photograph, barely visible in the background, was a figure watching them from the tree line. The image was too blurry to make out features, but the posture suggested someone who'd been observing them for some time. The timestamp on the camera indicated it was taken just days before their final journal entries. Miller assembled his team for an emergency briefing. The case had evolved from a tragic accident to something far more sinister. The evidence suggested the friends hadn't just been fighting the elements during their final weeks. They'd been aware of someone else in the area, someone who'd been tracking their movements and possibly interfering with their survival efforts. The detective pulled up a map of the region, marking the locations where evidence had been found. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been systematically visiting these sites, potentially moving or removing evidence over the years. The tense location, the scattered belongings, even the condition of the remains, all pointed to deliberate manipulation of the scene. Jake's father, Robert, had driven up from Denver when he heard about the latest developments. He sat across from Miller, his face etched with a mixture of hope and dread. For 14 years, he'd believed his son had simply been overcome by the harsh mountain environment. Now he was learning that Jake might have been fighting something far more dangerous than just the weather. The investigation took on new urgency. Miller expanded the search to include missing persons reports from the area dating back to the early 1980s. What they found was disturbing. 3 other hikers had vanished in the same general region between 1982 and 1986. All were young, all were experienced outdoors enthusiasts, and all had disappeared without a trace. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone had been using these remote mountain areas as hunting grounds, targeting isolated hikers and campers. The 3 friends had stumbled into a trap that had been set long before they'd ever planned their weekend getaway. Miller's team began interviewing old-timers in the area, people who'd lived and worked in the mountains for decades. One retired forest ranger, Tom Hutchinson, remembered something that had bothered him for years. During the mid-1980s, he'd encountered a man several times in the backcountry who'd claimed to be conducting wildlife research. The man had been evasive about his credentials and had always seemed to be in areas where hikers had recently gone missing. Hutchinson provided a description that matched witness reports from other missing person cases. A tall, lean man in his 40s, usually wearing military surplus clothing and carrying expensive camping equipment. He'd been particularly interested in areas where young hikers might seek shelter during bad weather. The detective realized they were dealing with someone who'd been operating in the region for years, Someone who knew the mountains better than most of the search and rescue teams, the killer had been using the harsh environment as a weapon, isolating victims and then either directly harming them or sabotaging their survival efforts. Mark's journal entries began to make more sense in this context. His references to feeling watched, to supplies going missing, to sounds in the night that didn't belong to the natural environment. The friends had been aware of the danger, but trapped by the weather and terrain, they'd been unable to escape. The case garnered national attention as news of the serial killer theory spread. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in to assist with the investigation. They developed a profile of someone who'd been using the wilderness as both a cover and a tool for his crimes. The killer was likely someone with extensive outdoor experience, possibly military or law enforcement training. He'd chosen his hunting grounds carefully, targeting areas where disappearances could easily be attributed to natural causes. The remote locations and harsh weather conditions provided perfect cover for his activities. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation intensified. The families of the three friends found themselves at the center of a much larger story, one that connected their tragedy to a pattern of violence that had been hidden in the mountains for decades. The evidence continued to mount. Forensic analysis of the camping equipment found at various sites revealed traces of sedatives, suggesting the killer had been drugging his victims to make them more vulnerable. The realization that Mark, Jake, and Sarah might have been fighting not just exposure and starvation, but also chemical impairment, made their story even more heartbreaking. Miller worked with mountain rescue teams to identify other potential crime scenes. The killer's pattern suggested he'd been active across multiple states, using the vast wilderness areas of the Rocky Mountains as his territory. The investigations expanded to include cold cases from Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. The three friends' story had become a key piece in unraveling one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Their courage in documenting their final days, their refusal to give up hope even in the face of impossible odds, had provided investigators with the evidence needed to finally bring their killer to justice. As winter deepened and the investigation continued, the families found comfort in knowing that their loved ones' deaths would not be in vain. The evidence they'd left behind was helping to solve crimes that had puzzled law enforcement for decades and bringing closure to families who'd been waiting for answers just as long as they had. The mountain wilderness that had claimed Mark, Jake, and Sarah was finally giving up its secrets. Their story of friendship, courage, and ultimate sacrifice had become the key to stopping a killer who'd been hiding in the shadows for far too long. The trail that investigators followed through the wilderness of our investigation led to one final, chilling discovery. Inside a forgotten storage unit, rented under an alias just days before the three friends' disappearance, authorities found detailed surveillance equipment, topographic maps of the exact region where the tent was discovered, and most disturbing of all, a journal containing meticulous notes about the friends' habits, routines, and planned camping locations. The journal entries revealed a level of premeditation that sent shockwaves through the investigation. The predator had been watching Mark, Jake, and Sarah for months, documenting their favorite trails, their camping preferences, even their work schedules. One entry dated just 3 days before their disappearance, read, "Weather forecast shows perfect storm conditions. Isolated location confirmed. No witnesses expected for minimum 72 hours." But the most haunting discovery came in the form of a detailed floor plan. Sketched with architectural precision, it showed the layout of an underground bunker, complete with holding cells, ventilation systems, and what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. The location coordinates, when cross-referenced with geological surveys, pointed to a remote section of the Colorado Rockies, approximately 15 miles from where the tent was found. Search teams mobilized immediately. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment, they located the bunker entrance, cleverly disguised beneath a natural rock formation. The structure was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, suggesting years of careful planning and construction. When tactical teams breached the entrance, they found evidence of recent habitation: fresh food supplies, updated newspapers, and most chillingly, 3 sets of restraints still attached to concrete walls. The forensic analysis of the bunker revealed traces of DNA from multiple victims, confirming that Mark, Jake, and Sarah weren't the first to be brought to this nightmarish location. Investigators found personal items belonging to at least 6 other individuals, spanning nearly a decade of disappearances across multiple states. The predator had been operating with impunity, using the wilderness as both hunting ground and graveyard. Among the recovered evidence was a collection of video recordings documenting the predator's interactions with his victims. The footage was too disturbing to release publicly, but investigators confirmed that it showed the 3 friends during their final days. Despite their desperate circumstances, the recordings revealed their unwavering loyalty to each other, with Mark and Jake repeatedly trying to protect Sarah, and all 3 attempting to devise escape plans even in their darkest moments. The investigation's scope expanded exponentially as federal agencies joined the effort. The predator's identity was finally confirmed through DNA evidence and fingerprint analysis. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, a former military psychologist who had been dishonorably discharged 15 years earlier following allegations of conducting unauthorized experiments on soldiers. His psychological profile painted a picture of a highly intelligent, methodical individual who had used his military training and psychological expertise to perfect his hunting techniques. Kellerman's background revealed a disturbing pattern of escalation. After his discharge, he had retreated to the wilderness, initially living as a hermit, but gradually developing his predatory behaviors. His military experience had taught him survival skills, while his psychological training helped him understand how to manipulate and control his victims. The combination made him an exceptionally dangerous adversary who had evaded capture for over a decade. The manhunt intensified as investigators realized Kellerman was still active and likely aware that his bunker had been discovered. Surveillance footage from a nearby town showed a figure matching his description purchasing supplies just days before the raid. He was on the run, potentially seeking a new location to continue his horrific activities. As the search continued, the impact of the investigation rippled through the outdoor recreation community. The revelation that a predator had been systematically targeting campers and hikers led to widespread changes in safety protocols. Park services implemented new check-in procedures, emergency communication systems were upgraded, and educational programs were developed to help outdoor enthusiasts recognize and avoid potential threats. The story of Mark, Jake, and Sarah became a catalyst for broader awareness about the dangers that could lurk in remote wilderness areas. Their courage in documenting their experiences, even in their final moments, provided crucial evidence that helped expose a criminal network far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Their detailed journal entries and photographs became key pieces of evidence in identifying other victims and potential crime scenes. The investigation also revealed the importance of modern technology in solving cold cases. The DNA analysis, digital forensics, and advanced search techniques that finally cracked the case wouldn't have been available when the three friends first disappeared. Their story became a testament to the persistence of investigators and the power of scientific advancement in seeking justice for victims. As winter settled over the Colorado Rockies once again, the search for Dr. Marcus Kellerman continued. Multiple law enforcement agencies remained committed to bringing him to justice, not just for the crimes against Mark, Jake, and Sarah, but for all the victims whose lives he had destroyed. The wilderness that had once been his sanctuary was now being systematically searched, with every cave, abandoned structure, and remote cabin being investigated. The legacy of the three friends extended far beyond their tragic fate. Their story inspired legislation requiring better tracking and communication systems for wilderness areas, led to improved training for search and rescue personnel, and created a network of support for families of missing persons. Their courage in the face of unimaginable circumstances, their refusal to abandon each other, and their determination to leave evidence for those who would follow became symbols of resilience and hope. The investigation ultimately revealed that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure. Mark, Jake, and Sarah's friendship had sustained them through weeks of captivity, and their story continued to inspire others long after their disappearance. Their detailed documentation of their ordeal became a powerful reminder that evil, no matter how carefully planned or executed, cannot ultimately triumph over the bonds of loyalty, courage, and love. The investigation into Dr. Marcus Kellerman's activities continued for months after his initial identification. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began connecting cold cases that had previously seemed unrelated. The sophisticated nature of his operation became clearer as investigators mapped out a network of remote locations he had been using for over 2 decades. What started as the tragic disappearance of 3 friends had uncovered one of the most extensive predatory operations in wilderness crime history. Kellerman's capture didn't come easily. When authorities finally tracked him to a remote cabin in Montana, they discovered he had been monitoring police communications and had likely known about the investigation for weeks. The cabin contained detailed files on dozens of potential victims, maps marking optimal hunting grounds, and disturbing evidence of his psychological profiling techniques. He had been selecting victims based on their hiking experience, group size, and planned routes, always choosing those least likely to be immediately missed or easily found. The forensic evidence from the bunker near where Mark, Jake, and Sarah died painted a chilling picture of their final days. Advanced DNA analysis revealed that Kellerman had been present at their campsite multiple times during their ordeal. Rather than helping them or allowing them to escape, he had deliberately sabotaged their survival efforts. Tool marks on their shelter materials showed signs of intentional damage. Their food supplies had been tampered with, and crucial survival equipment had been removed from their packs while they slept. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Kellerman had been documenting his victims' deterioration. Hidden cameras had been positioned around the area where the three friends made their final stand. The recovered footage, which became crucial evidence in his prosecution, showed him watching from concealment as they grew weaker and more desperate. He had turned their survival struggle into a form of entertainment, prolonging their suffering for his own psychological gratification. The journal that Sarah had kept became even more significant when forensic linguists analyzed the handwriting patterns. They discovered subtle changes in her writing style that corresponded with periods when Kellerman had been nearby. The stress and fear she experienced during his presence had unconsciously altered her penmanship, providing a timeline of his visits that corroborated other evidence. When the case finally went to trial, Kellerman was linked to 17 confirmed murders and suspected in at least 30 more disappearances spanning back to the early 1970s. His methods had evolved over the decades, becoming increasingly sophisticated as he learned to exploit the vastness and isolation of America's wilderness areas. The three friends from 1984 had been among his earlier victims when his techniques were still developing, but his predatory instincts were already fully formed. The families of Mark, Jake, and Sarah finally received the closure they had sought for decades. During the trial, they learned that their loved ones had fought bravely not just against the elements, but against a human predator who had systematically stripped away their chances of survival. The knowledge was both devastating and somehow comforting, as it confirmed that their children had been the capable, resourceful people they had raised them to be. The impact of this case extended far beyond the courtroom. The National Park Service implemented new safety protocols based on the investigation's findings. Wilderness areas began installing better communication systems and establishing more frequent patrol schedules. The concept of wilderness predators, previously dismissed by many as urban legend, became a recognized threat requiring systematic countermeasures. Search and rescue operations were revolutionized by the techniques developed during the investigation. The integration of advanced forensic analysis with traditional wilderness tracking created new methodologies that proved effective in other missing person cases. The multidisciplinary approach that had been necessary to solve this case became a model for similar investigations across the country. The story of Mark, Jake, and Sarah also inspired changes in how people prepare for wilderness adventures. Their journal, with its detailed accounts of survival attempts and resource management, became an unofficial handbook for emergency preparedness. Outdoor education programs began incorporating their experiences into training curricula, ensuring that future generations of hikers would be better equipped to handle extreme situations. Technology played an increasingly important role in wilderness safety following this case. GPS tracking devices, satellite communication systems, and emergency beacons became standard equipment for serious outdoor enthusiasts. The isolation that had made the three friends vulnerable to both natural and human threats could now be mitigated through constant connection with the outside world. The psychological impact of the case resonated throughout the outdoor community. The revelation that someone had been deliberately targeting hikers challenged the fundamental assumption that wilderness areas were safe from human predation. Support groups formed for families of missing hikers, and new resources were developed to help people cope with the unique trauma of having loved ones disappear in remote locations. Dr. Marcus Kellerman was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his incarceration, he provided information that helped solve several additional cold cases, though investigators believed he was still withholding details about other victims. His cooperation seemed motivated not by remorse, but by a desire to maintain some form of control and attention even from behind bars. The remote valley where the three friends died has been designated as a memorial site. A small plaque marks the location where their bodies were found, serving as both a tribute to their memory and a reminder of the dangers that can lurk in seemingly peaceful wilderness areas. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for their families and friends who visit annually to honor their memory and reflect on the impact their story has had on wilderness safety. In the years since the case was resolved, advances in forensic science have continued to build upon the techniques developed during the investigation. Cold cases from decades past are being reopened and solved using methods that were pioneered while searching for answers about what happened to Mark, Jake, and Sarah. Their legacy lives on, not just in the memories of those who loved them, but in the lives saved by the safety improvements their story inspired. Today, the Davidson Morrison Chen Memorial Trail winds through the very wilderness where three friends fought their final battle against impossible odds. Their story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the incredible strength of human bonds when faced with unimaginable circumstances. The legacy of Mark, Jake, and Sarah extends far beyond their tragic fate. Their ordeals have led to revolutionary changes in wilderness safety protocols, including mandatory GPS tracking systems for backcountry permits, enhanced communication networks in remote areas, and specialized training programs for search and rescue teams. The psychological profiling techniques developed during the Kellerman investigation have helped law enforcement identify and apprehend other predators who target vulnerable outdoor enthusiasts. Perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us that the wilderness holds both breathtaking beauty and hidden dangers. While we should never let fear prevent us from exploring nature's wonders, we must respect the risks and prepare accordingly. The friends' meticulous documentation of their survival efforts has become required reading in wilderness survival courses worldwide. Mark's final journal entry, written in his weakening hand, simply read, "We never gave up on each other." Those words have inspired countless hikers, families, and survivors facing their own struggles. The three friends may have lost their battle against the elements and evil that found them in that remote valley, but their courage, ingenuity, and unwavering loyalty to one another ensure their spirits will forever guide others through the darkness.